Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage and all the men and women are merely players. They have their X's and their interests. Why I remember that, I have no idea. But he was telling the truth. Welcome back, everybody, to Empowerment with Dr. Lawrence. I am your host, Dr. Lawrence. And I want to start off by thanking you for making us a part of your day. I know you have a choice of where you spend your time and what you listen to on your drive today. And I want to thank you for spending that time with me. Well, today I want to begin with a statement that I hope changes the way you think about yourself, your work, your relationships, and even your future. Everyone's performing, but not everybody's performing well. Think about that for a moment. We often use the word performance to describe athletes, musicians, executives, people standing on a stage. But performance is much broader than that. Performance is simply the output of your life. It's how you show up every day. Think about how you lead, how you parent, how you respond under pressure, how you make decisions, and ultimately how you move toward or away from the life that you say you want. Everybody's performing. So the question isn't whether you're performing. The question is, what is your performance producing? Is it producing peace, anxiety, growth, stagnation? Are you producing healthy relationships? Are you in constant conflict? Purpose? Are you in survival? Because whether we realize it or not, every single one of us is producing something with the life we've been given. And here's what fascinates me. I've spent over 20 years in mental health. I've worked with people from virtually every background you can imagine. CEOs, physicians, military folks, attorneys, teachers, stay-at-home parents, college students, okay? People with extraordinary accomplishments and people just trying to make it through another day. And what I've learned is this. Success doesn't guarantee performance. Some of the most successful people I've met with were quietly exhausted. Some were the wealthiest people I've ever met. They were emotionally bankrupt. Some of the smartest people I've met with consistently make decisions that sabotage their own future. And on the other hand, I met people with very little by society standards. They demonstrate remarkable clarity, resilience, and purpose. So that forced me to ask a question that eventually became the foundation of everything we're going to discuss in this series. Why do people with similar intelligence, similar opportunities, and similar resources produce completely different outcomes? For years, I thought the answer was knowledge. If people just knew better, they'd do better, right? Then I thought maybe it was motivation. Maybe some people simply wanted more. They just wanted it more. Then I considered discipline and habits and, the environment, support system, their education. And all of those things matter. But after years of listening to people's stories, I realized that that's not the starting point. They were the result. The real question wasn't what are people doing? The real question became, who is the person that's doing it? That question changed everything for me. Because before you can understand performance, you have to understand the person who's producing it, the person that's performing. And it brings us to today's topic, identity capacity. Now I realize that phrase may be new to you. You've probably heard people talk about self-esteem or self-confidence or self-image. That's not what I'm talking about. Identity capacity is something much deeper. It's the amount of performance your identity will allow before it pulls you back to what feels familiar. So think about that. Have you ever watched someone lose 50 pounds only to gain it all back? Have you ever seen someone build a successful business and then make one terrible decision after another until it's gone? Have you ever wondered why people seem to sabotage healthy relationships just when everything's finally going well? Most people blame behavior. I don't. I think behavior is simply revealing something much deeper. It's revealing identity. I remember a season in my own life that taught me this lesson in a way that no textbook ever could. Like many people, I spent years in corporate America before stepping into entrepreneurship. From the outside, leaving a stable career looked courageous. People congratulated me. They talked about freedom. They talked about being my own boss and building something meaningful. What they didn't see was the internal conversation that followed. When you work for a large organization, there are layers of protection. There are departments and supervisors and processes, and decisions get shared. When you own the organization, all that's gone. Every decision carries your name. Every payroll, expansion, mistake, and success. And I remember walking through the clinic one morning. Nothing unusual was happening. Patients were arriving. Staff members were doing what they always did. The phones were ringing. And on the outside, it looked like just another ordinary day. But inside my mind, there was a completely different conversation. I kept asking myself one question. What if I'm not enough? What if the business fails? Not What if we lose a client? The deeper question was about me. What if I'm not capable of carrying all of this? That one sentence influenced decisions that I didn't even realize I was making. Should we hire another provider? Maybe we should wait. Should we expand into another market? Well, let's hold off. Should we invest in this opportunity? Well, what if it doesn't work? Nothing in my environment had changed. The only thing that had changed was the story that I believed about myself. And here's what I eventually realized. My business wasn't being limited by intelligence. It was being limited by my education. It wasn't even being limited by my work ethic. It was being limited by the invisible ceiling created by my identity. The realization stopped me in my tracks because for me, how many other decisions that had I made because of my life story? I never even questioned these things. Maybe you've experienced something similar. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately assumed that you didn't belong there? Have you ever been in an opportunity, that was presented to you, and before anybody said a word, you talked yourself out of it? Have you ever found yourself thinking, people don't like me. They don't like, people like that. Those thoughts feel normal because we've repeated them for years, but they aren't facts. They're beliefs, and beliefs have consequences. One of the things that I've learned in my work over the years is that people often confuse familiarity with truth. Something feels true because we've believed it for so long, not because it's accurate. That's a dangerous place to be, right? Because once a belief becomes part of your identity, you stop evaluating it. You just simply live from it. Let's pause here and ask a simple question. Who told you who you are? Seriously, who handed you that story? Was it a parent, a teacher, a coach, a failed relationship, a business that didn't work, a diagnosis, a traumatic experience? Or did you slowly build it yourself through years of repeated experiences? Most of us have never stopped to ask that question. We inherited the identity that the same way we inherited family tradition. We simply accepted it. And once we accepted it, we began making decisions that reinforce it. That's one of the most fascinating things about the human mind. It loves consistency. And even when consistency hurts us, if I believe I'm not a leader, I'll avoid leadership opportunities. If I believe I'm always going to struggle financially, I'll make financial decisions that confirm that belief. If I believe conflict is dangerous, I'll avoid difficult conversations even when they're necessary. Not because these behaviors are logical, but because they're consistent with who I believe I am. And human beings will go to extraordinary lengths to remain consistent with their identity. Let's build on that idea for just a moment. If you've been listening, you might be thinking, Dr. Lawrence, are you saying everything comes down to identity? Well, not everything, but I am saying that identity is the lens through which almost everything passes. So think about a pair of glasses. If you scratch it, if the lens gets scratched, doesn't matter how beautiful the landscape is, you'll see the scratches. So identity works the same way. Your identity becomes the lens through which you interpret opportunities, relationships, and setbacks, criticism, success, failures, even God, even your relationship with God. That event isn't what shapes your life. It's the meaning that you assign to the event. And the meaning you assign usually comes from your identity. So let me show you what I mean. Imagine two employees receiving the same feedback verbatim from their supervisor. Supervisor says, I think you're capable of more. Well, one employee hears, man, great, I have an opportunity. They walk away inspired. The other one hears criticism and they walk away defeated. The words were identical. The supervisor didn't change. The difference wasn't the feedback. The difference was the identity interpreting the feedback. One person believes, man, I can grow. The other one believes, man, I'm not enough. That's a bad place to be. Identity interpreted the exact same experience two different ways. Now multiply that conversation by every opportunity, every disappointment, every relationship for 30, 40 years. Can you see how dramatically identity shapes performance? One of the things I often tell organizations is this. You don't make decisions based on reality. You make decisions based on your perception of the reality. And those aren't always the same thing. That's why two departments inside the same company can perform completely differently. They got the same CEO, same budget, same mission, same benefits. But one department is innovative, another department is disengaged. Why? Because organizations have identities too. One department says we solve problems over here. Another says leadership never listens. One says we're building something important. The other says we're just trying to survive. We're trying to get to Friday. Those identities become self-fulfilling. People begin behaving in ways that confirm the culture that they've accepted. The same thing happens in families. One family believes we're resilient. Another believes nothing ever works out for us. Well, guess which story gets repeated over the dinner table? Guess which story children begin believing before they're old enough to question it? Identity is contagious, whether it's healthy or unhealthy. It's contagious. Now, I want to ask you something that may make you a little uncomfortable. Have you ever noticed how quickly we defend our limitations? I mean, think about that. Someone compliments you. Oh, you're so disciplined. And then you respond, oh, no, I'm really not. Someone says you're a great leader. Oh, no, I'm just doing my job. Someone says you're really intelligent. I just got lucky. Isn't that interesting? We'll argue with compliments while accepting criticism without hesitation. Why? Because compliments challenge our identity. Criticism often confirms it. If your identity says, I'm not good enough, your mind will reflect evidence that disagrees with it. That's why some people can receive 100 compliments and spend the entire evening thinking about the one criticism. Identity filtered the evidence. I saw this over and over and over again in my work. Someone battling in depression would tell me nothing ever goes right. And I would ask them, well, tell me about the previous week. Eventually they would mention something positive. Maybe they had dinner with their family. Maybe they finished a project. Maybe they received some kind of recognition at work. Then I asked, why didn't you start with that? The answer wasn't intentional. Their mind wasn't looking for evidence of hope. It was looking for evidence that matched their identity. We all do this. Every single one of us. This is why I tell people that identity isn't just something you have. It's something that you protect, even when it hurts you. Now let me explain that. Suppose someone's believed for 20 years that they're always overlooked. Well, what happens when somebody finally notices them? Well, sometimes they might become uncomfortable, not because attention is bad, because attention conflicts with identity. Suppose someone has believed all their life that relationships always end in disappointment. Then they meet someone who genuinely loves them. Well, you think they'd relax. Sometimes they do the opposite. They become suspicious, guarded, hypervigilant. Not because the relationship's unhealthy, because healthy relationships don't fit the narrative they've been telling themselves. Identity always tries to preserve itself, even when preserving it causes pain. That leads us to what I call identity capacity. Here's the definition I want you to remember. Identity capacity is the amount of success, responsibility, influence, love, peace, purpose that you currently identify and can comfortably sustain before it begins pulling you back towards what feels familiar. Let that sink in. Notice I didn't say intelligence. I didn't say potential. Potential is what you're capable of. Identity capacity determines how much of that potential actually reaches the world. I know incredibly gifted people who never build anything, not because they lack ability, because they don't believe that they're the kind of person who could. And I know people with average talent who accomplish extraordinary things because their identity gives them permission to keep moving forward. When I was in the Army, one of the things we learned very quickly was that people rarely rise to the occasion. They fall back to their level of preparation. That's true in combat. That's true in business, in marriage. It's true in parenting. Preparation becomes identity over time. You don't have to convince a seasoned soldier to remain alert. He doesn't wake up asking, should I be alert today? No, it's just a part of who he is. Likewise, great leaders don't spend every morning convincing themselves to lead with integrity. Integrity in the task it's their identity. When something becomes identity, it no longer requires constant negotiation. That's one of the greatest differences between successful people and everybody else. The successful people they don't spend all their day negotiating with themselves. They've already decided who they are. They negotiate, that negotiation ended years ago. Now, let me say something that may challenge the way you've thought about personal growth. Most self-help is behavior modification. Wake up earlier, read more books, exercise, use a plan, and blah, blah, blah. Look, they're wonderful habits, but behavior modification without identity transformation is usually temporary. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to keep a promise that aligns with who you believe you are? If you see yourself as a generous person, Generosity isn't difficult. If you see yourself as an honest person, telling the truth isn't exhausting. If you see yourself as someone who honors commitments, showing up isn't a battle every day. Behavior flows naturally from identity. That's why New Year's resolutions always fail. Trying to change behaviors without changing beliefs, it's kind of hard. They're asking branches to produce different fruit while leaving the fruit untouched. Jesus addressed the heart because he understood this long before neuroscience ever existed. The root always determines the fruit. And if we're going to talk about performance, we have to be willing to examine the roots, not just admire or criticize the fruit. I think one of the greatest tragedies in modern culture is that we've become experts in managing appearances while neglecting identity. Social media awards appearance. Corporate culture often rewards appearance. Even churches can reward appearance. But performance isn't sustained by appearance. It's sustained by who you become when no one's watching. That's where identity lives. And eventually, every performance in public reflects the identity you've developed, the identity that you've cultivated in private. So if identity shapes performance, the next logical question is this: can identity change? I believe the answer is yes. In fact, I believe it changes all the time. The problem is that most of us don't notice it happening. Think back over your life. At some point, you probably believed something about yourself that you no longer believe today. Maybe you believe you didn't have the intelligence to earn a college degree. Maybe you believe that you would never own a business. Maybe you believe that you would never recover after this painful loss. Maybe you believe you were incapable of leading people. And yet here you are. Something changed. The circumstances may have played a role, but the circumstances alone rarely transform identity. More often than not, identity changes because repeated experiences begin challenging old belief systems. That's why mentors matter. That's why coaches matter. That's why healthy relationships matter. That's why faith matters. Every one of those influences has the potential to challenge the story you've accepted about yourself. But here's what I've learned. Identity doesn't usually change in one dramatic moment. No, it changes through repeated experiences, through repeated evidence. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, your identity shifts a little bit. Every time you have a difficult conversation instead of avoiding it, your identity shifts a little bit. Every time you choose integrity when compromise would have been easier, your identity shifts. Every time you do something your old identity says you couldn't do, you create evidence that the old story may no longer be true. And that's how transformation happens. Not overnight, one decision at a time. But I think that's the reason people become discouraged. They're looking for breakthrough, quick breakthrough. Life usually offers build-throughs, not breakthroughs, build-throughs, small moments repeated consistently until, one day you wake up and realize that you're no longer the person you used to be. Now that's encouraging because it means your past doesn't have to become your future. Your failures don't have to become your identity. Your diagnosis doesn't have to become your identity. Your divorce doesn't have to become your identity. Your childhood doesn't have to become your identity. Yes, those things are part of your story, but they don't have to become the title story. There's a difference. As a psychologist, one of the things that I've always fascinated me is how often people confuse description with destiny. Someone says, I'm anxious. Well, maybe. Anxiety is an experience. It doesn't have to become your identity. Someone says, I'm burnt out. Well, burnout may describe your current condition. It shouldn't define your future. Someone says, I'm a failure. No, maybe you've experienced failure, but experiencing failure and becoming failure, it's not the same thing. One describes an event. The other creates a prison. Words matter because your words shape beliefs and beliefs shape performance. And this is where I believe organizations often make the same mistake that individuals make. When a company sees declining engagement, increasing turnover or poor communication or burnout, the instinct is to address the visible behavior. More meetings, more policies, another leadership seminar, wellness initiative. Sometimes that helps. But if behaviors are driven by deeper issues, the solutions rarely last. Healthy organizations don't just ask, what are people doing? They ask why. Why are people doing it? That's a very different conversation. It's the same reason physicians don't simply just treat symptoms. They look for causes. If someone comes into the emergency room with crushing chest pain, the goal isn't merely to remove the pain, it's to get an understanding of why it's there. The same principle applies to performance. Poor performance is rarely the disease, it's usually just a symptom. And if identity is limiting performance, no amount of external pressure will permanently solve an internal problem. That's one of the reasons I became so passionate about studying performance, from multiple perspectives. Why? Well, the military taught me that preparation influences performance under pressure. Business taught me that systems influence performance over time. Psychology taught me that beliefs influence behavior. Faith taught me that identity influences everything. Each one gave me a different piece of the puzzle. Individually, they're great, they're helpful, but together they reveal something much larger. Performance isn't one dimensional, it's a product of multiple capacities working together. Today we've explored the first of those capacities, which is identity. And I hope you remember this. Identity is not about ego. It's not about self-confidence. It's not about pretending you're somebody you're not. Identity is about understanding the story that you're living from, because whether you realize it or not, you're living from one. The question is whether that story is helping you become the person you were created to be or quietly holding you back. So before we finish today, I'd like to leave you with one exercise. Not because exercises change people, because, awareness precedes change, right? This week, I want you to pay attention to your internal language. Listen carefully to the phrases you use about yourself. I've always been, I'm just not, people like me, I could never. Well, every one of those statements deserves another question. Is that true? Or is it just familiar? Because if it's just familiar, I'll say it this way. Familiar and true are not the same thing. Sometimes we've rehearsed a story so many years that we stop examining whether it's accurate. So our first step toward changing performance isn't just changing your habits, it's questioning the beliefs that created them. Next week, we're going to move into the second domain of performance, emotional capacity. Because even with a healthy identity, unmanaged emotions can quietly consume the energy, focus, and resilience required to perform at your best. And as you'll see, these domains don't exist independently. They influence one another every single day. That's why understanding performance requires more than motivation. It requires, that you understand capacity. So look, thank you for joining me in this conversation. I hope you spend time this week reflecting on that one question. Who do I believe I am? Because your answer to that may be influencing your performance more than you ever imagined. And remember, everyone's performing, but not everybody's performing well. Thank you for watching Empowerment with Dr. Lawrence. I'll see you next week.